We're very happy to have Dr. Jim Phelps with us. Dr. Phelps focused his psychiatric practice on complex mood disorders for over 20 years. He served on the International Society for Bipolar Disorders, Diagnosis, and Chronotherapy task forces. He founded the website psycheducation.org in 2000, and recently a simpler, shorter version, depressioneducation.org, leading to book invitations, Why Am I Still Depressed?, for patients and families, and a spectrum approach to mood disorders for professionals. Currently, Dr. Phelps is completing a series on YouTube at Psych Education, presenting the same material in 35-minute videos. He is a co-creator of Brainstorm, the film, a documentary on the bipolar spectrum premiered at World Bipolar Day in 2026 and scheduled for the national PBS airing in 2027. So welcome, Dr. Phelps.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you very much, everyone, for taking some time. I'm trying to make it worth your while. As Jeff mentioned, I'm with the ISBD as a member for quite some time. I'm sort of a closet academic. I've written a bunch of stuff, but it's really based on clinical experience. And I hope to share that perspective with you now. So when someone tells you why they should listen to you, you should tell them why they shouldn't. Here are the reasons why you might keep your skeptics hat on. I will mention a couple of things for which I get no money at all. The education website and the YouTube channel. And I'll show you, there's one more opportunity to see Brainstorm before it goes to public television. And I'll give you the dates and how to access it at the end here. So I'm going to talk about 3 transformations in psychiatry. I think this is really exciting. I hope you'll find it interesting. And I hope actually potentially changing the way you practice. That's why you're here, I hope. So I think the psychiatric diagnostic system is poised to potentially change. I'll show you how. I think we're making clear progress on understanding the mechanisms of psychiatric illness, at least bipolar disorders, which are leading to new treatment opportunities. So I think that's very exciting. And then you've probably heard the notion of using very low doses of lithium for the potential prevention of dementia. And I'll show you some of those data, why I'm so excited about it, for changing the reputation of lithium at minimum. As potentially prescribing psychologists. I hope that lithium is part of your armamentarium. If it's not, I hope to make it so. And if it already is, but you are having difficulty getting patients to accept it, I think these data could change that now. So here we go. The diagnostic system is changing. Well, imagine if Sandra comes in to see you as your next new client with depression. According to the DSM, the first thing you're supposed to do, or one of the many things, is to see if this depression is unipolar or bipolar, because of course, even bipolar 1 can present with what looks like major depression. In order to establish how common is that, and I'd like you to ponder, well, how how often do you think depression coming into your practice, like Sandra, is actually bipolar? How common is that? Of course, it depends on how you practice and what your referrals are like, but we ought to know what the base rate is in the general population. That'll help you understand at minimum what your estimates might be. So base rate estimates, you might know this book from Daniel Kahneman, are not common in the way people estimate the frequency of something like how common is bipolar. Um, this book, the Fast and Slow book, came from the formal book that he wrote with Amos Tversky called Judgment Under Uncertainty. Magnificent book, very old now. But one of the biases that they present there is what they call base rate neglect. So let's not do base rate neglect. Let's start by looking at base rates in the general population for mood disorders of all kinds, or the variations of depression, let's say. So what are those base rates? We should look at large epidemiologic studies to give us some actual numbers on that. And if we took 100 depressed Sandras, using that to make the math easier, it turns out that using those large epidemiologic studies, there would be 80 depressed Sandras in the unipolar department and 5 in the bipolar 1 land. So a 5 out of 100, that's amongst people who are presenting with depression, like Sandra. Well, you might wonder, where are the other folks? And so another 5 of them are depression with hypomania, or bipolar 2, but we still have some missing people. And so these data are coming from some major epidemiologic studies in the US and abroad, where they also looked at subthreshold bipolarity, or the bipolar spectrum. And lo and behold, there's another 10% of people who have subthreshold hypomania in these telephone survey. Answer these questions, please. format of detecting what kind of depression do you have and mixed states, particularly mixed states if we start to expand the definition of mixed states as has recently been done. So what does this mean, these numbers? Well, for one thing, it means that bipolarity is about a 1 in 5 probability if you didn't have anything in your practice to select a higher probability of bipolar, like if you take complex depressions, it's probably a higher number, like 1 in 4, which that 1 in 4 number can easily be justified. Even with these data, I've given you the conservative numbers for this. In other words, yeah, bipolar as a possibility when Sandra presents with depression, is definitely a probability, and in your practice, it ought to be something on the order of 1 in 5, unless somehow your practice selects away people with bipolar, and that's quite possible as well, in which case it might go down to as low as 1 in 10, but I doubt much below that. Well, you might be thinking, oh, well, yeah, but suppose this subthreshold hypomania in mixed states, what does that mean for treatment? Or do we really treat those differently than in unipolar? The answer is, from my point of view, yes, it means that we should be avoiding antidepressants more likely in these people than we do for unipolar. We should be thinking more likely to use social rhythm therapy, and I'll present you some data on SRT to make it part of your kit bag, your toolkit, if you don't already have it there, and lamotrigine. So not antidepressants, and thinking about these other potential antidepressants that have mood stabilizing capacity as well. So when Sandra comes in, then you're not thinking bipolar or unipolar, you're thinking where on this spectrum is Sandra? How much bipolarity does she have? And could she be somewhere here in the middle? Well, I think you probably know from clinical experience, to rule out hypomania, and particularly to rule out subthreshold hypomania and mixed states, is a major time consuming endeavor. In fact, it's really hard to say, I've done it and it's not there. You can say, I've done it, but to say for certain that it's not there is extremely challenging. I think some people might say near impossible. So I'm going to show you a different way of thinking about that now that's coming maybe for us in the next DSM. Remember, this is transformation number one. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to make the picture worse for you first, because not only is there a spectrum of mood, there is also a spectrum of anxiety. 50% of people with mood disorders have DSM diagnosable level anxiety, and that anxiety itself exists on a spectrum. So, really, what we should have is a three-dimensional model, 3 axes, that looks like this. A person could be in euthymia but have anxiety. Person could be heading toward mania and also have anxiety, or toward depression and also have anxiety, or really any admixture. So this is the reality that you're faced clinically, including when you see Sandra as she shows up in your practice. And this has been acknowledged by mood specialists for years, but the DSM doesn't work like this. The DSM says you either have this, or you have that, or you have that. So we are missing the subtlety of all these other people who exist in intermediate states between these poles of diagnoses. And what's exciting about the new DSM discussions is that they are potentially going to change. It isn't for sure yet, and move from, here's the jargon terminology, move from a categorical system of the DSM to a dimensional, or at least include a dimensional way. Dimensional is the jargon term for spectrum, include a spectrum way of thinking about mood and anxiety like this. This was first published in January of this year. There's a subcommittee that's looking at including this dimensional way of thinking about diagnoses, and they said that patients are distributed smoothly from low to high numbers across dimensions without leaving clear gaps between clusters. In other words, they're describing this. They also said that in redesigning the DSM structure, they intend to capture both categorical and dimensional constructs. In other words, we aren't going to abandon the categorical way of thinking, but if this team that's looking at the next DSM gets its way, they will include a dimensional approach as well. So we can think more flexibly about, well, diagnostically, where is Sandra in this at least three-dimensional map? we could include some other dimensions like psychosis, how psychotic, I mean, go off in a fourth dimension, but I couldn't map that one for you. So we'll leave it like this for now. Well, what are the implications of this potential change in the DSM? Firstly, and if you think of nothing else from this evening, if it hasn't already been your conclusion, I invite you to conclude that uncertainty about diagnoses in this territory is wisdom. That's the kind way of putting it. The less polite way of putting it would be to be certain about something is imprudent, shall we say. So, when I'm working with trainees and I hear someone say, well, oh no, she doesn't have bipolar disorder. It's like, well, wait a minute. How do you know that? You should not be so certain about that really ever until, clinical courses proving that, yeah, mood instability is not part of the picture. So it isn't that you'll stay uncertain forever, but especially with a client's initial presentation, coming out of that initial interview with uncertainty is wisdom in this territory. This is actually making its way into the literature now with a terminology that you may run into called epistemic humility, epistemology, theory of knowledge, um, recognizing that it's hard to know things for certain, epistemic humility. And then another implication of this potential DSM change is that the rapid mood screener, which I'm sure you've heard of and some of you may be using, well, it's a categorical tool. It's a yes or no tool. The questions are yes or no. The supposed cutoff at 4 or more is a yes or no system. Well, that really is not compatible with this dimensional way of thinking. And it's actually really not a good way of thinking about screening at all, anyway, because there are so many people with subthreshold presentations. And that tool was actually developed specifically for bipolar 1. So when your clients are presenting like Sandra, it's actually much more likely that if they have a bipolar variation, it's going to be one of these non-MAD versions statistically. So we should be using a screening tool that can capture them and not having a 32% rate of false negatives for bipolar 2, as it did in the second validation trial where they included people with bipolar 2. So if you're going to use the RMS, you should modify it for greater sensitivity. And I won't go into great detail about this, but we did manage to get this editorial published. And here is a modified RMS, and I will show you in a moment where to go get it. The difference here is that we have set the thresholds at previously accepted thresholds, not for bipolar 1, but for all versions of bipolar, including using bipolar 2 thresholds for duration, for example, 4 days instead of 7. So this modified RMS, modified to increase its sensitivity, you can find that on my depression education website. I don't make any money from this website. It doesn't sell anything, but if in the search term, it's in the search bar up there on the top, you put in RMS, you'll find a bunch of different variations, PDFs and Word versions that you can change, and a little description of the RMS itself at the bottom. So if you're going to use an RMS, use this. We're moving on to our second of these three big transformations in psychiatry from my point of view, and that is that we are making progress on understanding the mechanisms of at least one psychiatric illness, and I think several, but bipolar in particular. Let me show you. So I hope you've puzzled over this. What causes this thing that can be like, a manic presentation or a depressive presentation from one problem, presumably one problem? How can that be? Well, here are some insights into that from recent research. There are 5 of these that are major pathways in terms of understanding the mechanism of bipolar. I'll just gloss over, hit the high points on 4 of them, and then I'm going to focus on one of them because it's most directly tied to a treatment tool that you may not be currently using or emphasizing. So genetics, well, it's genetic for sure. It's the most highly heritable of psychiatric disorders. On the other hand, genetics is not absolute prognosis because it's hard to tell. It's not a fate predictor. Even people who are carrying the genes that are now being identified for bipolar won't necessarily find them expressed in terms of behavior and experience because of epigenetic changes superimposed on those genes. So we're learning more about the particular genes involved, and part of the answer here is that, yeah, there's a bunch of them. But a few of them are starting to be identified that have more clout, so that we're getting in the direction of maybe being able to predict for people what's the probability that your offspring, for example, is vulnerable or how vulnerable. Inflammation is now clearly recognized as part of mood disorders in the brain, and inflammatory factors from the gut and get to the brain through several different channels. So thinking about gut inflammation and inflammation generally is a new whole avenue in terms of thinking about treatment. Metabolism, both peripheral and brain metabolism, is also clearly a pathway into bipolar symptoms. You've probably heard about the ketogenic diet, helping people shift away from their brain burning glucose as a fuel to burning ketones, the fat back up to glucose as a fuel, and doing that through dietary changes that make it difficult to get the glucose supply to your brain. So instead, people's brains switch to burning ketones. And lo and behold, that has helped people come completely out of psychosis and stay psychosis free on multiple case reports. We're still in the realm of case reports almost entirely. There is a small randomized trial showing that this does have feasibility, but efficacy relative to a sham procedure. We don't have a big trial for that. And what is clear is that it is a challenge for people to stick with a ketogenic diet. So that's exciting, but not clearly like ready for primetime treatment applicability yet, except for maybe a highly motivated subset, particularly those who had like treatment resistant psychosis. It's another plausible tool to consider even right now. What's also clear in metabolism is that mitochondria, there's something different about people's mitochondria, those who are living with bipolar, and that in part helps explain why when people are depressed with bipolar depression, energy, a profound lack of energy. It's not just a depression, it is something wrong with your mitochondria. You can't move kind of depression. And then some fascinating stuff going on in the realm of psychology with reward sensitivity, the very short version being this young man who's looking at his cards. People living with bipolar looking at those cards have a higher likelihood of thinking that when they bet, they're going to get the good outcome. So a reward hypersensitivity, a tendency to latch on to the potential for reward and overestimate it is part of the bipolar experience in the world, even during euthymia. Moreover, we know from the work of a remarkable team at the University of Pittsburgh where in the brain that overestimation takes place in the left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. And it's so localized that they've even used a transcranial magnetic stimulation device over that left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex using not the stimulating mode of TMS, but the inhibiting mode, 1 cycle per second instead of 10, which can damp down neuronal activity directly underneath the wand. And lo and behold, damping down that tendency to overestimate reward. But you don't have to do this with TMS. You could do this with cognitive therapy, which is also being explored by the Pittsburgh team. So what if you just teach this young man, you have a proclivity to overestimate the probability of reward in this setting. You should be careful. You should also be careful about what that other guy has behind his back. But at least in your own brain, you can work on your own proclivity. That's reward hypersensitivity in a tiny little nutshell. And now I'm going to turn to the biological clock differences because these have a direct treatment implication that I hope you're applying even now. Let's see. So you know about the biological clock and how it governs all of these physiologic cycles. And you know that what the biological clock amounts to is an internal signal for most people around 24 hours. Some people is a little more like 25. Saying to your body, this is day, this is night. Well, people with bipolar, people living with bipolar, have a different clock. It tends instead to have a lower amplitude of the magnitude of this internal signal. This is day and this is night. So the immediate treatment implication then is that if we could just strengthen that circadian rhythm, that this would have a mood stabilizing effect. And this has been demonstrated in a number of different ways. So the question then in terms of turning this into practice is, how do you strengthen circadian rhythm? Well, I'm sure that's probably quite well known to you. What is the strongest factor, the Zeitgeber, time giver that sets circadian rhythm? It's light and darkness. So people living with bipolar, to get another mood stabilizer on board, could use the strengthening of their circadian rhythm, including doing so by getting more light when it should be light and more darkness when it should be dark. Wait a minute. You've already done this, and you've discovered that trying to convince people to get more darkness when it should be dark is a behavioral challenge because bedtime comes when it should already have been dark for quite some time, right? And what's natural is for it to be dark when the sun goes down. And yet, we in our modern electronically lit environments are getting light long through that period when it should be dark. So, just telling people, well, you shouldn't use those electronics and stay up late watching television. Well, you know what it's like trying to sell that idea. It just doesn't go over very well. Ah, but you can cheat. You can use a virtual darkness. So I'll just tell you briefly the story that I think many of you have heard, but you may not have seen the physiologic pathway of it. Light affects our circadian rhythm, not through rods and cones, but through another retinal photoreceptor called the retinal ganglion cell. Its fibers do not connect to the visual cortex, they go instead to the hypothalamus, to the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus, where, among many other things, the hypothalamus tells the pineal gland, don't secrete melatonin just now because we are in a lit environment. Well, it turns out, and here's the key to the whole thing, that not all wavelengths of light are equal, that only blue light stimulates the retinal ganglion cell. And so you can have artificial darkness simply by blocking blue light, because no blue light reaching the retinal ganglion cell is the physiologic equivalent of darkness. And you can show that because under the right circumstances, namely when the rest of the circadian rhythm says it should be dark and time to secrete melatonin, by even in a fully lit environment, blocking blue light, melatonin is secreted just as it should be. Well, how do you block blue light? You've heard of these amber lenses, blue blockers. And so there are a number of physiologic studies showing that this whole pathway works just as I've just described. So when I discovered this many years ago, I said, hey, I wonder if we could use this for bipolar because we could do dark therapy without having to try to convince people to not use their electronic devices and electrically lit environments. And so just put up a couple of 20-person case series. Well, lo and behold, a colleague in Norway took this and did a randomized trial. Which was published in 2016. The International Society for Bipolar Disorders said this was the most important paper of 2016. On an inpatient unit, people admitted with mild to moderate mania were randomized into blue blockers or control, and you can see what happens. In Norway, they were not being so aggressive about trying to get people unmanic. So even at the end of a week, they hadn't shifted all that much. Whereas the people who got the blue blocking lenses, everyone getting treatment as usual, including antipsychotics, but the blue blocker group, only half as many antipsychotics discharged from the hospital sooner. And as you can see, their scores coming down more quickly. Well, the reason I show you this is because this is the transformation in psychiatry. Look at this, what happened in Norway after this. They were building a brand new psychiatric unit at the time. Howard Karlstad, who was in charge of this building project, a psychiatrist, said, hey, we should take the opportunity. We should build two identical wings, one with no blue light environment and one with conventional lighting. And then we could do randomized trials because people get admitted to one and then the other unit in random sequence. So they actually have published now a randomized trial of what happens when people get admitted to this unit versus that unit. I think a remarkable achievement unto itself. Now, they were going to use length of stay as one of the outcome measures, the primary outcome measure. There have been prior randomized trials of dark therapy, and length of stay was one of the outcome measures. So they were going to use that too. But their length of stay on these units was so short that they really couldn't see a difference. But they also measured something called the Brosset checklist. And this is a nursing checklist done at every shift. So 3 times every 24 hours, patients were rated on this checklist for these 6 variables that are associated with violence, including actual violence, but also things that are associated with it. And the Brosset checklist scores over 6 months, looking at the 2 different units. You can tell there's going to be a difference here, but look at the size of the difference. The scores of significant risk for violence, 73 versus 8 on those 2 different units. So a huge difference that survived multiple efforts to check for other potential variables to explain it. But another facet of interest here is that this was not just applicable for people with bipolar. It was applicable for everybody who got admitted to that unit, except for the people who got admitted with depression who serve as kind of a control, if you will, where there was no difference in the events. It was everybody else showing this difference in potential liability for serious events on the units. So we have these data to support the idea that trying to help people understand more darkness before bedtime is a good idea. I think when you boil this down, it's a key part of social rhythm therapy. And if you haven't used this workbook yet, this is a very simple way to introduce yourself to SRT and immediately turn around and start using it with clients. That's the whole soup to nuts version of SRT. The really simplified version that I think gets a big chunk, maybe the biggest chunk, maybe the most important chunk of SRT is simply to teach people to have a regular bedtime and a regular rise time and to use calculated exposure to darkness and light as part of the way to help people get there to a regular bedtime and a regular rise time. Because, as you know from clinical experience, just trying to help people get to a regular bedtime and a regular rise time can be a huge behavioral challenge. So, you can help people get there with strategic use of darkness, including virtual darkness and light. I'll just point out that on my psychoeducation YouTube channel, this is about a 30-minute video because it's made for patients and families. The shtick that I just gave you on how to get to sleep control as a mood stabilizer using calculated use of light and darkness. That's all on that video. So you could save yourself the breath of doing that over and over again by pointing people to this video, and I'm not making any money or selling anything on that YouTube channel. So what are the implications of this? Well, for one thing, not only does it show you that we can go from a mechanism to a treatment, and I think we're doing that for all of these, but it shows you the importance of teaching and facilitating a regular bedtime and a regular rise time. And by the way, if you're building an inpatient unit, you should build it with no blue light at night built into the lighting system, if you happen to be doing that this week. In the meantime, let me check the chat. Tyler, thank you. Your question, any particular type of blue blockers? On my website, depressioneducation.org, there's a page on light therapy and dark therapy. And the dark therapy page includes the whole shtick about blue blockers and includes the specific types that people can get that are very inexpensive, like $6, I think, for one of them, and 13 for the fancier version. So people don't need to buy the $50 or $80 versions. They can buy something that costs $6 to $10. And so those are on my depressioneducation.org website, and you can use the search bar and look for dark therapy, and you'll find that. And you ask, should we all be wearing blue blockers since we have so much screen and computer time? Not during the day, because during the day you want that blue light that's telling your suprachiasmatic nucleus that it's daytime. But at night, like starting around now on my end of the country, perhaps already on yours, yes. Now, some people are really sensitive to these things. Like when I was handing these out to my clients and patients, some people would come back and go, yeah, this really didn't do anything. And in my experience, people will find out within 4 or 5 nights using them between, say, the hours of 8 p.m. and 10 p.m., because more than 2 hours, it's really hard to manage these things. About half the people would come back and say, it didn't do anything. The other half came back and said, it's amazing. I fall asleep about an hour earlier when I wear these things. So that's what you're looking for. And you can use that as a trial and say, if they don't work, bring them back. I'll clean them up with some alcohol swabs and give them to somebody else. And you can try them yourself to see if it has an impact on your ability to fall asleep more quickly. There are a couple of randomized trials of using it just for insomnia, not for people with mood disorders, that were positive trials. So yeah, point out to your colleagues that you shouldn't be wearing them during the day, only when you're trying to have real darkness. Now, some people who have super sensitive nervous systems, including people who are somewhat neurodiverse in terms of their environmental stimulus sensitivity, might benefit from some blue blockade during the day. And they might even experiment with some of the blue blockers that are funkier. They're not such complete blue wavelength blockers to see if they might be of benefit. How do you determine which patients might realistically benefit from interventions like ketogenic diet? Thank you for the question, Jamie. A ketogenic diet is difficult. It is inexpensive somewhat, but the food's somewhat more expensive than regular food. And there actually are some risks to really pursuing ketogenic diets. So it should be done with a physician's understanding of that this is going to be done. So there are some risks there. Whereas blue blockers are cheap, they are virtually harmless. one patient in that first Norwegian randomized trial got acutely depressed, came in manic, which were in the blue blocker group, and got depressed. They took him out of the trial, stopped using the blue blockers, and he came right up out of that depression. They can be so powerful to take someone right out of a manic episode into a depressive episode. I think that's unusual with blue blockers, but we should be mindful of that potential. For some people, they could be really powerfully anti-manic and mood stabilizing, because I think nearly anything that's clearly anti-manic is likely to be a mood stabilizer, although technically that needs another randomized trial to assert that. So, but the point was, and thank you, Dr. Wilson, for your question. Some things are cheap and easy, and some things are challenging and potentially more expensive and maybe carry some risk. And so I would just sort those and help my client understand that these are potential options. And as you can gather, I think just trying to teach people to have a regular bedtime and a regular rise time is at the very top of that list. We're going to move on to this third transformation that I see coming here, which is the possibility that very low doses of lithium might prevent dementia. And the relevance here, particularly from a mood disorder specialist, and you may not be seeing people with minimal cognitive impairment necessarily unless you're a gerontology specialist, which some of you may be, trying to prevent dementia. That's obviously going to be relevant for a huge swath of our aging population. But I think this is also of interest because of if this turns out to be true, this will change the reputation of lithium. And if lithium's reputation was to change, then our practice, I hope, will change. So let's take a look at some of these data. If you just watch the red box, let me just scoot you through the population. So in 1950, this was the age distribution. In 2025, it looks like this. In 2050, it's going to look like that. So just going backwards, it goes in the red box. We are an aging population. We all knew that. Well, what is a common age-associated, life-threatening, life quality destroying? It's Alzheimer's. So if there was something that could prevent Alzheimer's, we certainly are interested for a variety of reasons. Well, let's take a look at this lithium story. You probably heard about this paper published in the esteemed journal Nature from the Harvard team studying mice mostly. This is mostly about mice. There's a little human data in there. I've summarized this extremely important paper, trying to translate it into basically plain English for your better educated clients and their families who are interested in this, including you, because trying to wade through that paper is a huge challenge. It took hours because Nature, the journal, only allows you to have 5 figures, and yet people who publish in Nature are publishing the results of 30, 40, 50 experiments as this group did. Well, how do you jam all that in there? Oh, well, you have 5 or 6 figures per figure. There's like 40 figures in this paper. Let me just show you the two main findings that come out of this. The first is addressing this question: could lithium prevent progression to Alzheimer's? Well, we're going to look mostly at data in mice, although they look briefly at some data in humans. And this is what we're trying to do: is prevent progression. In other words, you would potentially start lithium before the onset of any minimal cognitive impairment. Is that logical, data based? Is there anything to suggest that this might be worth considering, like even now? Well, in a mouse, there's a mouse model of Alzheimer's. It isn't perfect, so the analog here is not perfect, but they do form amyloid plaque just like humans do when humans develop Alzheimer's. And they also phosphorylate tau, and their tau proteins turn into tau tangles just like humans. So in those respects, the Alzheimer's mouse is a somewhat good model. It's what we have. Well, what they did was take Alzheimer's prone mice, they were genetically bred to have that predilection, and treated them with low doses of lithium. Two different kinds of lithium: lithium carbonate, which is, as you know, the one we've been prescribing all this last 50 years, and lithium orotate. And lithium orotate selected because they thought it might be less vulnerable to getting sequestered in those amyloid plaques, which turns out to be the fate of lithium in the brain, according to other data in this paper. So they're going to compare lithium carbonate and lithium orotate in the Alzheimer's mouse. Here's the key study, and I'll show you the data from this one because it's so important. Here's the control mouse who was fed only water, typical water, regular old water, no lithium in their water. And the plaque burden they developed by old age, as you can see in the immunofluorescent stain, and their plaque burden, they're the control. So their plaque burden is 100% of control. They are the controls. Well, imagine what that bar is going to look like, or the fluorescent stain for the mice that got lithium. Where's that bar going to go? Well, those who got lithium orotate in their water from early adulthood, because we're trying to prevent this plaque development, here's what their plaque burden looks like that, like close to zero. That is the key finding from this paper, the first of two. They checked several different doses of lithium orotate, two other higher doses, with pretty much the same results. They also looked at lithium carbonate because lithium carbonate has been studied in several randomized trials for the prevention of dementia. And it turns out, oops, lithium carbonate doesn't work so well. So maybe lithium orotate, at least in the mouse model, clearly works better than lithium carbonate. What dose? Well, we don't know what the right dose is because they didn't use a dose that was low enough to show you that it didn't work. We don't know where the bottom of this progression is yet. I hope someone will turn around and do that. But for the moment, we know that 4.3 microequivalents per liter in the mouse water was enough to get this stunning result. If you were to ask me, what's the human equivalent of that? It's actually zero point 0.5 milligrams of lithium orotate per day is the human dose equivalent for an 80 kilogram person for that mouse dose. What does that mean? We don't know. There are no studies of lithium orotate for the prevention of dementia in humans, but we know plenty of people have been taking lithium orotate for a long time. So we know that it appears to be quite safe, and I'll talk about that more in just a moment. Lithium carbonate, not so good. As far as the phosphorylation of tau and the tau proteins that we know is part of the pathophysiology in human Alzheimer's, same exact story here, including with lithium carbonate, not so effective. What do we conclude from all of this? Well, wait a minute. There's one other facet of this study, and that is that lithium might actually have the potential to reverse already established minimal cognitive impairment. How do we know this? Well, in a mouse, if you put them in a swim tank, they don't like that. If there's a platform there, they'll swim to it. And if they do this 6 days in a row, they'll learn where that platform is and swim straight to it. Whereas the Alzheimer's mouse, sorry, doesn't remember where the platform is and swims all over the place. So we can use swim time as a marker for memory. The more time they spend on the platform, the target area, the better their memory. If we look at the wild type mouse, they spend this much time in the target area. The wild type meaning they're not even Alzheimer's prone, so they don't have Alzheimer's. So this is our control mouse. 3 different Alzheimer's prone mice, some that get lithium and some that don't. In the first group that just got water, but they're Alzheimer's prone, you can see this is the fate of an Alzheimer's mouse. They don't remember where the platform is. They spend more time swimming. Those who got lithium orotate, now not from early age, but from late middle age in a mouse, sort of like 55, 60 in a human, roughly. Hard to make that analogy, but just to give us a ballpark, those who got the lithium orotate, how much time did they spend swimming around? They're much more like the control mouse, the not Alzheimer's susceptible mouse. And lithium carbonate, same as the plaque prevention, didn't work so well. So I think the implications of that are clear, and I'll just skim over that to say we really need to be thinking about lithium now, not only for the prevention of Alzheimer's, but even for the potential treatment of it, because the other treatments are scary and we don't have much else, and it's a disastrous condition, Alzheimer's. I think thinking about lithium for the treatment of minimal cognitive impairment now is even a candidate potential. So I wrote all that stuff up on my YouTube channel. If you want to pursue any of those or send patients and clients there, I don't make any money from any of these things either. And that then is my presentation for this evening. George, can you turn off mute and say hello and any thoughts or comments before I pick up something from the chat?
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jim, for a wonderful presentation. Some really exciting developments. I think they're very, very useful to really all mental health professionals, particularly the idea of thinking dimensionally, which is something we've been seeing in our clinical population. And I think many of us have probably been thinking that way anyway, but like you said, the diagnostic system is now beginning to catch up what I think may have been the practice of many clinicians. So incredibly useful developments. I do want to mention that Dr. Phelps and I will be presenting this year at the American Psychological Association convention in August. So if you are going to be attending, we would love to see you there. We will be talking a little bit more about mixed bipolar, and we'll mention some of the developments that we've talked about here. And one of the things I thought about while you were talking about blue light is, first, so many people use screens before they go to sleep. These tend to be pretty heavy on blue light, but there are filters that that people can install, which can really diminish the amount of blue light. And from my own practice, because I do so much work with kids and teenagers, I immediately thought about the importance of parents being very proactive about helping kids develop healthy habits and consistent bedtimes.
And modeling that they too can model avoiding exposure to blue light at night. And as you point out, it filters at the level of the TV or your handhelds, and just getting a no blue emitting light bulb. So you could have the rooms that you use late at night just have no blue come out of their light bulb. There's another way to do it without the glasses. Dr. Miller asks a very important question. How have you factored out or in chronic trauma? The answer is, you could say, is really complicated, actually, but the simple version is when people have both bipolarity and a trauma history, trying to treat the trauma history without having addressed bipolar mood stability, I think, is going uphill. So treating whatever bipolar component might be there first and then trying to address trauma, I think, is a much easier way of going about it, with some potential exceptions granted. Moreover, trying to separate out the two, is this depression with PTSD, or is this bipolar mixed state with, as Roger McIntyre calls the four A's: anxiety, anger, agitation, and attention problems? Is this depression plus anxiety and anger and attention problems? Is it depression plus PTSD? Is it depression plus ADHD? Is it depression plus GAD? Is it depression in borderlinity? Or is it a bipolar mixed state? That diagnostic differential, if you just look at symptoms, is nearly impossible. All of those four variations, PTSD, ADHD, GAD, and borderline, all have nearly all the same symptoms as depression and bipolar with mixed features: anxiety, agitation, attention problems, and anger. So how can you manage if all the symptoms are basically almost 100% overlap? And the answer is, there are four other factors that help detect bipolarity: age of onset of first depression, family history, course of illness, meaning how cyclic is it, and response to treatment, mainly like adverse responses to antidepressants. Age of onset, family history, course of illness, response to treatment. We should make those four things part of our routine assessment of bipolarity and depression in order to differentiate PTSD, GAD, ADHD, and borderlinity. It's a long version, but I hope you see that the maneuver is simple. The practice is very, very complicated, as you know, but the logic and the maneuver is pretty simple. For clinicians interested in learning more about low-dose lithium, lithium orotate, reputable sourcing, I put more on that Psych Education YouTube channel, and there's a playlist about dementia and lithium. I put more there than I found anywhere else, and been very careful about differentiating opinion from data. And so starting with just the plain English translation of the Nature paper, I think, is a really important starting place in terms of understanding, in mice, this is what we have observed. So even though it's my stuff, that's where I'd go first. There is a lithium orotate page on my website as well. And then you could say, okay, after that, what else? OpenEvidence.com is an AI supported way to browse the literature. I think I'd turn and go there because it goes in the National Library of Medicine and treatment guideline databases, and stays away from potential AI hallucinations. Over-the-counter variability, as part of that question about lithium orotate, that's a huge potential problem. I just did see something. If you if you let AI search, you can't get it if you go to consumer labs directly, but AI will search their database and steal their report on about 5 different versions of lithium orotate that met consumer lab standards for there really is lithium in there, and there are no other trace elements that could be concerning. And one of those is KAL, and one of them is something else. But if you just use Google AI and search lithium orotate, independent laboratory examination of content, something like that, you'll probably get that consumer lab list. KAL is one of them, which was a relief to me because that's the one that I'm buying from my local grocery store. In case you wondered, am I taking it? Well, you betcha. If I'm this enthusiastic about it, you'd think that I ought to be. Yes. Dr. Fogel asks, if dimensions are going to be considered in DSM-5, what is the likelihood that the new one actually includes it? Well, good question, because that paper that I referenced from January in the American Journal of Psychiatry, that's just the team that's being invited to consider this. That is not necessarily, we're going to do this. But I think they've committed themselves so far in that direction. I think from what my read of that article, have a look. I think there's full text online. I think it looks pretty likely because all they're doing is going to say, yeah, both of these are valuable, both dimensional and categorical. And no, I think cynicism in this territory is highly, highly warranted. And we're not going to switch to a dimensional system. We're just going to add it alongside a dimensional system. And the weight of the DSM carrying us back into yes or no, you have it or you don't. I think your cynicism is highly warranted. But at least in my view, this is progress. All right. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. And George, thanks for setting us up. Bye now.
Thanks, Jim. We'll see you next time.